Question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Monash.
I'd like to thank you, First Deputy Speaker, for giving me the call, and I thank the member for Trobe for his words, having great experience as a former serving police officer himself. The reason there was a lot of controversy when these laws were introduced, Mr Deputy Speaker, was this, that they actually affect our freedoms. I don't know what you're like as a Member of Parliament, but every time I see a piece of legislation like this, I place into it my children and my grandchildren. And I say, what if this legislation was directed at my child or my son and they were detained without charge for a period of time? That's why these issues are controversial. That's why when we, as a parliament, decide to extend the powers for another 12 months, whether they have been acted on or not, or these powers have been used or not, they are there and they give an enormous amount of power to the Australian Federal Police to, well, act on our behalf. Act on our behalf. And as long as they are acting on our behalf, we will applaud each move that they make. But all of these powers can be misused and abused. I know no one else will come in and talk about that today, but the reason they were so controversial in the first place was because of exactly that. I'm here as a Member of Parliament to not only serve my constituency and this nation, I'm here as a Member of Parliament to protect my constituency and this nation, even sometimes from our own government. And you say, what a preposterous proposition you're putting, that somebody somewhere would abuse these laws for their own benefit, that there would be no corruption in this country whatsoever, there'll be no person that ever steps out of line. Well, that's not what history tells us down the line, and that's why so many people who are libertarians, if we can call them that, I don't know what you call them these days, there's not many left.
Not many of us left.
Not many. That actually look at these issues and take them really seriously. Because if powers like this were misused, your freedom's gone. And I think they have been in Australia in the last 12 months, particularly in Victoria. But that's another whole issue which we won't go down that track. So the government and the former government, there'd be no difference. They are deciding that we should extend these powers for 12 months. So I immediately went to legislation. I looked to see, now, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this so we can give some consideration to other legislation that may be put in place, and we'll get the consideration of the government of the day. It will get consideration of the backbench committee of the government of the day, or the caucus committee of the government of the day, and the caucus committees or the backbench committees of the opposition of the day. It will be debated in the House. There will be consideration and by the party rooms, the caucus and the party rooms of these things, and so there will be further consideration of this issue as we build up to new legislation that may cover it. So I start to feel a bit more comfortable because I know the backbench committees in my party and the caucus committees within the Labor Party are not stupid. And there are men and women in there that have views about these particular issues, and they will voice them. They'll voice, and then it'll go to the Senate. And I believe the Greens or others will ask it to be considered by a Senate committee. So it will be considered again. So I'm just making the point that when we come to make legislation in this House, there's far more consideration given to it than what is in the Herald Sun for just a fleeting moment. Because it has been given, and I'm sure, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the independents will want to have something to say about powers that affect the freedoms and obligations of the Australian people. I don't want my children or my grandchildren or any of my family or those that I care for to be pulled up in the street for no reason whatsoever. Now, I think that you can be pulled over in a car for no reason whatsoever, for just a check. That was never the case years ago, never the case. You couldn't just be pulled up for no reason, just for a check. But I think you can now. I think you can now. And so the bill's important, and all the reasons for the listing of why the bill's important and to protect the nation, as the member for Trobe said quite rightly, the threat to Australia is still real and probable. And I don't even like the ads on television that talk about the reenactment of the Bali bombings. I don't want to watch a reenactment of a horrific event which was a major attack on hundreds of Australians who happened to be there at the time, and Germans and French and all the other people that were caught up in that horrible situation. I hate terrorism. I hate the fear that drives it, and I hate for the disregard for human life that surrounds it to create more fear. But I also fear that incremental changes to our freedoms are grievously important. And if governments of the day and if members of Parliament as individuals don't have regard for the freedoms that are crucially important to a nation that has spent blood for such freedoms, and they can't be incrementally taken away, piece by piece, little by little, until the individual no longer has the right that the previous generation enjoyed. That's the only point I'm making here. There is good reason for this legislation to be put in this way, because the Parliament wants more time to consider. And I've just been through before the member for Wright got here as to there are a number of backup provisions and a number of committees that go through any legislation before it gets to the point of being enacted. So we've had a big fight about this a long time ago, about this legislation. We had a big fight about the controversy of it. And it wasn't even in the context of an immediate threat. There have been times in this country where we've faced the terrorism threat, and in fact some damage has been done by individuals, and all of these things that are in this bill do go toward protecting Australians. I don't deny that. And there can always be good arguments put up for bad legislation. I'm not suggesting this is bad legislation. I'm just suggesting to you all that protecting freedoms in this nation should be number one, number two, and number three.
Absolutely.
Because when I leave this place, and guess what, we all do. One day, even you two younger members of Parliament, the younger members of Parliament on the other side, one day we all leave. And I'm going to make sure when I leave this place, I'm going to leave this nation as free as it was when I came here first in 1990.
Great country.
Right? Because that is really important to me. That's the legacy that we must leave as a nation. When our men and women have gone and shed their blood overseas for us, and you ask them why, and they will say, because we were fighting for the freedom to live the way we want to live in this nation. I'm not going to go into the restrictions that were put in place in Victoria because of COVID, the excuse that was given, and the responses that happened there, and the powers that they then claimed back to enact what they wanted to enact using the Victorian police. So I am very, very attuned at this time to any legislation that may affect the health, well-being and freedom of movement, freedom of association. especially freedom of association and freedom of movement. And I want to be able to walk down the street in the freest nation in the world. I know we're not under threat like other nations like Israel and Palestine and what's happening in the Middle East. We don't live that life. We're not waiting for a missile to come roaring over from nearby in Ainsley or somewhere, from Mount Ainsley, and drop into Parliament. We don't live that life. We're not Israelis, we're not Palestinians, we're not all people under threat around the world. And it gives us a different view. It says, so the Australian view says, should be right, you can bring in legislation like this, there's not a problem, unless it's misused or abused. Now, why would it be misused or abused? I don't know. The options are we don't have legislation like this at all and then the federal police can't act. Well, that's not a go either. That doesn't work for me either. You have to give the powers to the federal police to be able to act on your behalf. But at the same time, I notice each time there is judicial oversight along the track. So if... No, they haven't been used. But once these laws are in place, and it wouldn't surprise me if in 12 months' time the government doesn't come back and say, look, we need another 12 months. And then they've been enacted and in place for a number of years. I think what this should be saying is, if this comes back again, there should be amendments moved to say, no, we'll do a full review. A full review. Absolutely. Now, this legislation says that we're working towards new legislation. I don't want to run out of time here. And that's fine, except the sunset clauses are put in legislation like this because of the seriousness of the legislation. They're not put in there just to say, oh, we'll have a look at that at the end of a certain amount of time. The sunset clauses are put in there to say, yes, we recognise how important this legislation is to the freedom and well-being of this nation. We recognise that. So we're putting a sunset clause so the government of the day, which is a new government, has to come back and look at the legislation. They have to. Because there's a sunset clause there, and I'm sure the Australian Federal Police are saying, rightly, to the government, look, these laws have been extremely important to us to be able to use if we need them. If we need them. So they're there ready to go. We have been very careful on how we've used them to this point, and they have, clearly, because they haven't used any of them. Yep. But they've been very careful as to how they've used it, because they know how sensitive this is to the Australian people. Well, I suppose a lot of the Australian people just expect us, expect you two, and you, Mr Deputy Speaker, to act on their behalf. They want to believe that you are protecting them in everything you decide in this place, so they don't have to worry about it. And they will say to me, Russell, we elected you to make these decisions. I had some contractors in my house, and I won't tell you what the issue was one day, but they said, if you don't make it compulsory, that'll be fine. And I said to them, and one of them turned to me and he said, look, he said, Russell, we actually elected you to make this decision. So I feel a very heavy responsibility when it comes to bills like this that affect the individual freedom of everybody in this nation. Because I believe Australia needs to be a beacon of freedom. We need to be a place where people know they can come, they can get refuge, and they can live in a free society. This may sound all like rhetoric to some people, but it's real, because it's real legislation. They can really arrest you. They can arrest you without charge. They can accost you without charge. Yes, it's serious, because it's all about our freedoms, and that's why I'm pleading with all parliamentarians, take this legislation very seriously. Make sure that you give anything that comes up that's going to affect your personal freedom or your family's personal freedom or your grandchildren's personal freedom, make sure that you give it your best shot and that you are very comfortable with what the government's doing at any time in legislation that has such a dramatic effect. We've had the blue about it, now we're agreeing with it and supporting this legislation. Thank you for your indulgence.